Eve, to start off, could you lay out to your knowledge what some of the primary interests of the Canadian state are in Peru?
Well, there's significant Canadian investment in the country, or something around more than $15 billion. About half of that, a little more than half of that is mining. And so there's Canadian banks, Scotiabank, been a big player there, but the mining sector is really where Canada's a major player. And the Canadian state has shown significant interest in the mining sector in Peru going back many decades. You see, the early 2000s, the Canadian International Development Agency began a like $10 million mining sector reform project. Canadian diplomats have shown very clearly that they are um, seeking to advance Canadian mining interests. Everything from what they share on social media in terms of sharing graphics about the wonderful things that Canadian mining companies do in Peru, to to bringing up uh, Peruvian officials to the biggest, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada conference, which is the biggest mining conference in the world, which takes place in Toronto every year in March. So the Canadian state has shown, the diplomatic apparatus has shown that it's it spends a lot of time advancing the interests of Canadian mining companies, but Canadian investment more generally as well.
Hmm. And would you be able to paint a picture on the scale of the mining operations within Peru, just maybe in reference to Peru's GDP, or what this sort of looks like, just to give folks a sense of scale?
Yeah, well, there's different estimates out around, but 70 Canadian companies operating in the country. One estimate says it's nearly $10 billion in Canadian mining investment, which works out to, I think they said 4% of GDP for the country. Mining is obviously a big part of the Peruvian economy. So Canadian companies are a sizable portion of the whole mining sector. So yeah, it's a big part. I think that mines are mostly in more rural areas, but a big chunk of sort of wealth in Lima, comes from owners of mining companies, of engineers, of lawyers, of all the different, officials that the mining sector, mining companies kind of employ give profits to. And so it's a significant chunk of the Peruvian economy. And I don't know what, like, in a big picture of Canada's economy, that's not that significant, $10 billion, but it's a fairly substantive part. I think Peru would be one of the top places for Canadian mining outside of Canada, after maybe the US, maybe Mexico. I can't think of another country would necessarily be a bigger place of Canadian mining. Maybe Chile. I'm not sure, but that Peru would be almost certainly in the top handful of sites of Canadian mining investment, and that's from a country that's this global mining powerhouse.
Hmm. Hmm. And so for some people that might be hearing those numbers and saying, "Oh, well, it's good that we're investing in their economy, and it's helpful for Peru that we're operating there and bringing our technology or whatever to Peru." What have you heard in terms of the actual effects of the operations and presence of Canadian mining companies in Peru, in terms of its effect on the population, the environment there? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I think people, Peru's divided on these issues. I think it's really important to note that there are place, there are people in Peru who have done very well by the mining boom, and right, and I think it's quite um, regionally divided in that sense. In that people in Lima, which is the wealthiest part, have a lot of the benefits have accrued to a place that has very little of the um, costs of mining. And the costs are borne by the local communities. Some of the benefits are derived by local communities. You should be very clear, there are people who are, who get jobs in mining. They tend to be capital intensive, so it doesn't tend to generate a lot of jobs. Uh, um, uh, and well, like there's been tons of conflicts at Canadian operated mines in Peru going back many years. And in fact, the model of local opposition to mining, to some extent, that sort of followed elsewhere in the region. It was in response to a Canadian company in Peru in the late 90s, Manhattan Minerals, and the community of Tabo Grande organized a community referendum on basically a popular referendum on whether they wanted the mining operations. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but overwhelming opposition from the local community. I believe, I can't remember the details. This is in the, like early 2000s. They they were able to actually kind of win in the short term at least, because it was so overwhelming. But so I would say that it's divided. There's lots and lots of conflicts. I've seen reports going back 10 or 15 years ago. There was a report that said it's like 40% of all social conflicts in Peru were around mining, with Canadian companies kind of the biggest source of those. So it's like, disputes, all kinds of people have been killed by security forces at uh, Canadian run mines. So they pop up, sort of periodically. It doesn't get that much attention here, but in Peru, and obviously in the local communities, it gets significant attention. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's not a, I guess, a black and white issue of it's all good, it's all bad. I think that the local communities, particularly indigenous communities, which is where a lot of the mining operations are in the south, and uh, there's there's a um, there are some benefits, but the local communities are often kind of pulverized in forcing through the operations. And then there's the ecological question also. There's obviously local opposition is often tied to the ecological question, because it's often their water streams and their environment that's polluted, and that's part of why they don't want the mines. But there's bigger picture ecological question as well, in terms of just like this extractive model, and is this sustainable for humanity's ability to survive on this planet, where we just rip up all different pieces of the earth and suck out whatever we want to suck out, and then move on to the next place, and eventually there's nowhere that's not devastated. So um I don't think it's I lend towards the notion that, first of all, that it's principally those who are living next to the mining sites, or where the minerals are, that have the overwhelming should have the overwhelming say over whether there's extraction or not. And also through the lens of the fact that we need to reduce the extractivism that we're seeing, not just in Peru, but as a general kind of rule, for ecological reasons. And Canadian mining companies and the Canadian state are of course pushing in the opposite direction of more extractivism and superseding the will of local communities.
Mhm. And so to switch gears a bit and to talk about the coup, this article that I'm writing is prompted by recent uprisings, the kind of cyclical takeovers of Lima by pro democratic movements in the country. So there was a recent uprising in July, continued demands for the resignation of Dina Boluarte and the freeing of Pedro Castillo. Could you speak to the the larger reaction of the Peruvian people to the coup that happened in 2021?
Yeah, I believe it was in 2022. It was in December of 2022, I believe.
Oh yes,
Uh,
sorry, December 2020. Yeah, you're right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing in understanding Canada's reaction to the coup was that Castillo, his first foreign minister, one of the first things he did was he said that the Lima group of governments that were trying to overthrow Maduro, the Venezuelan government, that was the worst thing they ever done in the history of Peruvian foreign policy. That was very embarrassing to the Canadian government, which was with the Peruvian government, the two countries that really created the Lima Group. They wanted it to be called the Lima Group, not the Ottawa Group, because it sounded, Ottawa Group would sound more like it's the North Americans, trying to overthrow the government. It sounded better to have a Latin American name to it. So the Canadian government, Pedro Castillo was from the left. I speaking here now as somebody who doesn't follow Peruvian politics that closely. My understanding is that it really wasn't a particularly functional government. There were lots of uh, errors that were made in a fairly short period of time. The Congress refused to allow them to govern properly, so it was under assault from the big media in the country and the capitalist kind of reactionary forces. So it was caught in a very difficult position, but it wasn't particularly effective within those confines. Um, so the Canadian government, as just a general rule, does not like leftist governments well, anywhere, but specifically in this hemisphere. And they have a long history of backing U.S. And the militaries in different countries overthrowing those governments. So this isn't a particularly new thing, even just during the Trudeau government. I mean, they tried to overthrow the government in Venezuela. They went along with they were somewhat active in backing the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019. They went along with the ouster of um, Brazilian Rousseff in Brazil. That was a little bit more of a constitutional kind of impeachment process thing, but so the Canadian government was happy to see Castillo ousted and Boluarte take over, and they assisted it, and they assisted it by the day of at the Organization of American States. They right away, the Canadian official says that Castillo's ouster was a step forward for democracy. They framed it all in this idea that it was he had tried to break the rules of democracy and therefore needed to be thrown in jail and the like. And they've continued to push that. So if you look at especially in the 2 months after Castillo was ousted, and Dina Boluarte, sort of usurper government was very shaky. There were mass protests. They killed 50 plus people in suppressing the protests. During those 2 months, Canada's ambassador, Louis Marcotte in Lima, met with like almost every different minister of the usurper, the replacement government. Melanie Joly has a call with her counterpart. I believe she maybe even had a call with Boluarte. So they worked quite hard, and you can watch it with Americans too. Of course, they were working to shore up this replacement government at a time when it was quite shaky. So it was not like massive Canadian support. It's not like in 2004 where Canada, sent in troops to physically help Americans oust Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, or there's some other examples in the history of Canadian coups where it's much more aggressive involvement. But this was more at the sort of level of passive support. But it was a clear I'd say a bit beyond passive, a clear sort of low level support, diplomatic support. They brought the ministers for the government to like I mentioned, the Prospectors and Developers Association, the Canada meeting, and the like. Um, so Amnesty International, about a month ago or so, put out a report about the killings after the coup, where they said that at least 50 people were killed, and they document some of what transpired and how there's been no officials really sort of, no police really sort of properly held accountable. And they called on Canada to not to restrict arms permits to Peru in that context. It's not a significant Canadian arms trade, but that's a pretty symbolic kind of move to show that we don't agree with what's going on. We're not going to okay any new arms permits. But my understanding is the Canadian government hasn't really responded to that. But yeah, so it's a Canadian it's a Canadian support for the coup, a low level, uh, mostly diplomatic support. Probably if you went further and you learned more about the some of the groups, the civil society groups that Canada's been financing in Peru, it wouldn't surprise me. You find out that there's a tendency for the groups that are sort of okay with the ouster of Castillo, or maybe even back the ouster of Castillo. That would be my guess. That's a general pattern where you find that the aid funding and funding of civil society organizations is often aligns with the bigger pro coup kind of policy. But yeah, so it definitely, the Trudeau government was fine with the ouster. And like recently, in response to the elections in Venezuela, the Andrew Coyne, the Globe and Mail and CBC columnist and commentator, he posted that the Boluarte government is refusing to recognize, or saying that Gonzalez is the actual president, refusing Maduro, and kind of return to the whole Juan Guaido Lima group thing that happened back in 2018, 19. Um, and and so Andrew Coyne is like, yeah, Canada needs to get right behind it and join Peru. I mean, it's like a joke. Like this, Boluarte doesn't. There's not even a pretense of elections. There's no one claiming that there was any election won. But that's kind of the state of commentary on foreign policy in this country.
Mhm. And so just to kind of tie the two main subjects that we've been talking about together, the Canadian mining interests and the coup, I'm just wondering if you could make like a direct link between Canada's support for this coup government coming after a leftist sort of pro-nationalization of resource government, well, yeah, national resource government, and the intensification of or just kind of consolidation of Canadian mining interests in Peru. What do you see as the link between those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely a link. Castillo had some kind of, there was popular pressure on him to back away from some of the mining. I don't believe that he did move in a sort of an anti-extractivist kind of direction, but there was some kind of rhetoric around nationalization, which is something that's very popular, right? That is widely believed among there's two kind of currents going on. One is there would be lots of local communities who just want no extractivism, but then there's a current of people who are saying maybe a broader, pretty widespread current saying we should be getting much greater if it is being extracted, we should be getting much greater benefits, be that higher taxes, be that full-on nationalization, be that higher royalties. And my understanding is that Castile was kind of uh, uh, echoing that kind of and making some steps in that direction of the broader kind of getting better nationalist kind of policies. Now, my understanding is that Boluarte has really moved forward with a doubling down on mining and there's a new plan. I was reading about it, something Unidos, a new initiative of sort of like an economic plan that really has expanding mineral extraction as right at the center of the project. So I think it's pretty fair to say that it's not like a radical change, but there is a clear change towards a more extractivist and a more foreign or open to foreign investment extractivist model. And the Canadian government, I think that was understood. That's part of why they didn't like Castillo. That's part of why the ruling class in Lima didn't like him. He was more attuned to listening to social movements and some of that kind of anti-capitalist or nationalistic, or exactly how you want to define that thinking. I think there's also a regional integration kind of element to it. But yeah, so Canadian business capitalist interests, they're pretty attuned to their interests, and they're pretty on the ball when it comes to uh, different political climates, right? And you see that in the business press where they talk about these things on the business pages, the Report on Business in the Globe Mail, or the National Post's, the Financial Post and the National Post. Um, and there's an element of it is that actually just plays out the level of, if you have a government, even if it's not doing the full-on policy shifts that one may want, of like banning either banning new permits or banning extractive operations. Just having a government that's sort of a little bit attuned, that kind of empowers social movements to be a bit more bold in making their demands, and which effectively, even if they're not fully successful, they can just make mining companies' lives a bit more difficult. So that's something that Canadian mining companies are concerned about. We should be also really clear about this, is that the Canadian embassy in Lima, like, this is they know exactly what's going on. They follow these issues very closely. They would have a very good institutional knowledge of the scope of Canadian mining operations across the country. They often will go to the mines and do sort of like photo ops and stuff like that at the mines. They provide all kinds of very clear-cut diplomatic cover for the companies. They provide all kinds of background of working with Canadian companies, working with the different ministries in Peru. They help them in that sense. So they're very attuned to these interests, and they're not, this is not hidden, right? They define Canada's interest as principally the interests of Canadian companies operating in that country. And so obviously that shapes how they look at things, and that shapes their willingness to provide cover for the overthrow of of an elected president.
So just one last question to end this interview off. You know, you've touched on this a bit throughout the interview, in terms of how Peru, you know, represents a microcosm of, you know, Canadian foreign policy in, not only in the region but just more generally. Um, yeah, how do you see that the way that, yeah, just to synthesize, how do you see the way that the Canadian government has been moving, over the past couple of years, their policies towards Peru? How do you see that that reflects their general, foreign policy when it comes to, you know, especially the, Central and South America?
Well, Owen Schock and I just co-authored a book called Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, and we detail over 20 examples of Canada uh, passively or actively uh, supporting the overthrow of elected government. And so I think that what transpired with Pedro Castillo is fits within this long pattern, uh, and that pattern is it's continued. The Trudeau government has continued it. They go on and on about supporting democracy. They'll say that their conflict with Russia or China or Iran is about like those are the authoritarians and we are the democracy bloc, while just the Trudeau government, backing the ouster of Castillo, even more actively the coup against Morales, trying to oust the government in Venezuela, uh, and then Canadian government, doing variations of that for more than 20 examples since 1953. So this is a pattern. The other side to this, the anti-democratic pattern, the supporting coups, and the supporting of the coup is mostly about alignment with Washington. I think that's the overarching theme, is that you're aligning with Washington as they subvert a social democratic or socialist kind of oriented government. That's the history of Canadian coups, and that's a part of what we've seen in Peru. But the other side to it is the corporate interest, and specifically the mining sector. And a big chunk of Canadian foreign policy is about advancing the interests of Canadian mining companies. And you see that very, very clearly in this hemisphere, where Canadian companies are big players in most countries of the hemisphere. And the Trudeau government, when they were elected, they said they were gonna bring in the ombudsperson. There was lots of campaigning around a proper ombudsperson to hold Canadian companies accountable if they were found to be engaged in huge abuses abroad. And when I say accountable, all it meant is ending direct subsidy through diplomatic support, right? So it's not like held accountable, like being thrown in jail, but just not getting public support for their operations if they're found to be engaged in significant abuses abroad. And the Trudeau government announced that they were going to do that before getting elected, and then they moved some steps down that pathway. And then there was a huge lobby campaign from the mining industry, and they basically came up with a powerless, toothless ombuds position, which is not that much different than what the Harper government had done a few years earlier. And that's just this one sign of how the Trudeau government has very much uh, continued this sort of pro-mining policy, and Canadian aid assists mining operations abroad, Canadian diplomacy, in the more extreme cases, even sort of some Canadian military. So that kind of policy has continued in the Trudeau government. Now, the other part in terms of the hemisphere, I would say that the Trudeau government, as you mentioned, with the Lima Group, they back in that was set up in latter half of 2017, and then it got really going with the Juan Guaido self-declaration in early 2019, and that was part of this Canadian policy of basically being hostile to the left in the hemisphere and being hostile to um, the left, partly as I was kind of getting at from the mining sector, and the left governments tend towards a bit more nationalist mining policies, but also partly just as a way to sabotage regional integration efforts. And that Canada basically sees the region from the same lens as Washington. And that's why the CLAC, the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, that was set up in 2010, 2011, it excluded two countries, right? It included Cuba and excluded two countries, the US and Canada. And because there's a sense that we need to, as a hemisphere, we need to have, the Organization of American States has been dominated by US, Canada have been a significant player as well. That's get away from that model and get towards integration model. And the Canadian government has been hostile to that. And I think, not incorrectly, right? That the Latin American integration efforts is about weakening North American power. And so I think that the ouster of Castillo kind of fits a bit within that lens as well. Um, but yeah, the Canadian foreign policy in the hemisphere under Trudeau has been pro mining, pro Washington, pro imperialist, and the difference between Trudeau and Harper has been pretty minimal. It's basically in some ways, in fact, what they did with Venezuela was Christian Freeland did with Venezuela is kind of unique in how aggressive Canada was in that whole process. But yeah, they've continued a very sort of belligerent pro corporate kind of policy.